Hello, everybody. Happy Halloween. You have stumbled upon a Halloween story time. I am your hostess, Mimi. If you are new to my channel, welcome. Hello. I do book readings and skits. So if you've never seen me before, hi, welcome. It's nice to have you. Um, I am back from taking something of a summer hiatus, so this is my very first read from my break. So I thought, let's start ourselves off right, shall we? Let's get into some ghost stories. So, if you are, again, new, you will probably have missed my previous Halloween readings and my entire list of books that I've already read. It's quite a lengthy list at this point, so you've got lots to catch up on. I am reading from what I call my ghost story Bible because look at this. Isn't this gorgeous? Look at that. I've had this book forever. I don't even remember where I got it, but there are so many great classic stories in here. Um, Poems, long stories, short stories, from everything from Jane Austen to Nathaniel Hawthorne. There's Shakespeare in here, so there's a little something for everybody. So if you end up liking this particular reading, I hope you do, because I think I've picked some of my favorite stories yet. Please feel free to go back and watch some of my other videos, give some likes, give some comments. I absolutely love interaction from all of my followers and my viewers, and maybe subscribe if you feel so inclined, but no pressure. So we're gonna read until these stories are done. I can't remember exactly how long they are. I think I had well over an hour's worth of reading last Halloween, so it was a lot. It might not be quite that much this year, but you never know, because I can't remember exactly how long the stories are that I picked. But without further ado, the first series that we will be reading, the first story, is my absolute personal all-time favorite, The Red Room by H.G. Wells. "I can assure you," said I, "that it will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me." And I stood up before the fire with my glass in my hand. "It is your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. "8 and 20 years," said I have lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet." The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open. "Aye," she broke in, "and 8 and 20 years you have lived, and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There's a many things to see, when one's still but 8 and 20." She swayed her head slowly from side to side. "A many things to see, and sorrow for." I half suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened into an impossible sturdiness, in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. "Well," I said, "if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind." "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the sound of a stick and a shambling step on the flags in the passage outside, and the door creaked on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent, more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by a single crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made straight for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered arm gave this newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire. I said, "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm, when the coughing had ceased for a while. "It's my own choosing," I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time, and threw his head back for a moment and sideways to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again. "Why don't you drink?" said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer towards him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful with a shaky arm that splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched upon the wall and mocked his action as he poured and drank. I must confess I had scarce expected these grotesque custodians. There is to my mind something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seem to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable, with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me, and to no one other, to one another. "If," said I, "you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will make myself comfortable there." The old man with the cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from under the shade, but no one answered me. I waited a minute, glancing from one to the other. "If," I said a little louder, "if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will relieve you from the task of entertaining me." "There's a candle on the slab outside the door," said the man with the withered arm, looking at my feet as he addressed me. "But if you go to the Red Room tonight—" "This night of all nights," said the woman. "You go alone." "Very well," I answered. "And which way do I go?" "You go along the passage for a bit," said he, "until you come to a door, and through that is a spiral staircase, and halfway up that is a landing and another door covered with baize. Go through that and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left up the steps." "Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me in one particular. "And are you really going?" said the man with the shade, looking at me again for the third time with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face. "This night of all nights," said the woman. "It is what I came for," I said, and moved towards the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade rose and staggered round the table, so as to be closer to the others and to the fire. At the door I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders, with an intent expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open. "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well alight, and then I shut them in and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of these three old pensioners in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-toned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room in which they foregathered, affected me in spite of my efforts to keep myself at a matter-of-fact face. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were different from this of ours, less certain, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. Their very existence was spectral, the cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains. The ornaments and conveniences of the room about them were ghostly, the thoughts of vanished men, which still haunted rather than participated in the world of today. But with an effort I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, draughty, subterranean passage was chilly and dusty, and my candle flared and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes rang up and down the spiral staircase, and a shadow came sweeping up after me, and one fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the landing and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I heard. Then, satisfied of the absolute silence, I pushed open the baize-covered door and stood in the corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected, for the moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or silvery illumination. Everything was in its place. The house might have been deserted on the yesterday instead of 18 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets or upon the polished flooring was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in the moonlight. I was about to advance, and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by the corner of the wall. but its shadow fell with marvelous distinctness upon the white paneling and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. I stood frigid for half a minute, perhaps. Then, with my hand in the pocket that held my revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymede and eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a porcelain Chinaman on a buhl table, whose head rocked silently as I passed him, scarcely startled me. The door to the red room and the steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the Ganymede in the moonlight, and opened the door of the red room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the landing. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turned the key I found in the lock within, and stood with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great red room of Lorraine Castle, in which the young Duke had died. Or rather, in which he had begun his dying, for he had opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I had just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of his gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place, and never, I thought, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. And there were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-credible beginning of it all, the tale of a timid wife and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her, and looking around that large shadowy room, with its shadowy window bays, its recesses and alcoves, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darkness. My candle was a little tongue of flame in its vastness that failed to pierce the opposite end of the room, and left an ocean of mystery and suggestion beyond its island of light. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place at once, and dispel the fanciful suggestions of its obscurity before they obtained a hold upon me. After satisfying myself of the fastening of the door, I began to walk about the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed, and opening its curtains wide. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows before closing the shutters, leaned forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney, and tapped the dark oak paneling for any secret opening. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantel-shelf, too, were more candles in china candlesticks. All these I lit one after the other. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it, to keep down any disposition to shiver, and when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it and regarded the room again. I had pulled up a chintz-covered armchair and a table to form a kind of barricade before me, and on this lay my revolver, ready to hand. My precise examination had done me good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place, and its perfect stillness, too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort to me. The shadow in the alcove, at the end in particular, had that undefinable quality of a presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking living thing that comes so easily in silence and solitude. At last, to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it, and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood that candle upon the floor of the alcove, and left it in that position. By this time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although, to my reason, there was no adequate cause for the condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen, and to pass the time I began to string some rhymes together, Ingoldsby fashion, of the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason I also abandoned, after a time, a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the 3 old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The sombre reds and blacks of the room troubled me. Even with 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The one in the alcove flared in a draught, and the fire flickering kept the shadows and Numbra perpetually shifting and stirring. Casting about for a remedy, I recalled the candles I had seen in the passage, and, with a slight effort, walked out into the moonlight, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, and presently returned with as many as 10. These I put in various knickknacks of china with which the room was sparsely adorned, lit and placed where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, until at last my 17 candles were so arranged that not an inch of the room but had the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me that when the ghost came, I could warn him not to trip over them. The room was now quite brightly illuminated. There was something very cheery and reassuring in these little streaming flames, and snuffing them gave me an occupation, and afforded a reassuring sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily upon me. It was after midnight that the candle in the alcove suddenly went out, and the black shadow sprang back to its place. I did not see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger. "By Jove!" I said aloud, "that draught's a strong one," and, taking matches from the table, I walked across the room in a leisurely manner to relight the corner again. My first match would not strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily, and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished. I rose at once to my feet. "Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself in a flash of absent-mindedness?" I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed it. There was no mistake about it. The flame vanished, as if the wicks had suddenly nipped between a finger and a thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step towards me. "This won't do," said I, and first one, then another candle on the mantel-shelf followed. "What's up?" I cried, with a queer high note getting into my voice somehow. At that the candle on the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed. "Steady on!" I said. "These candles are wanted," speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness, and scratching away at a match the while for the mantel candlesticks. My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the window were eclipsed. But with the same match I also relit the large mirror candles, and on those, on the floor near the doorway, so that for the moment I seemed to gain on the extinctions. But then, in a volley, there vanished 4 lights, at once in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in quivering haste, and stood hesitating whither to take it. As I stood undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out to the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror, I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, and then into the window, relighting 3, as 2 more vanished by the fireplace. Then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed box in the corner, and caught up the bedroom candlestick. With this, I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought against returned, and crept in upon me. First a step gained on this side of me, and then on that. It was like a ragged storm cloud sweeping out the stars. Now and then one returned for a moment, and was lost again. I was now almost frantic with the horror of coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting and disheveled, from candle to candle, in a vain struggle against that remorseless advance. I bruised myself on the thigh against the table, and I sent a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell and whisked the cloth from my table in my fall. My candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another as I rose. Abruptly, this was blown out as I swung it off the table by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the two remaining candles followed. But there was still light in the room, a red light that staved off the shadows from me. The fire! Of course, I could thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were dancing between the glowing coals and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps toward the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished. The glow vanished. The reflections rushed together and vanished, and as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me like the shutting of an eye, wrapped about me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed the last vestiges of reason from my brain. The candle fell from my hand. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and, lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then I think I must have staggered to my feet. I know I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and, with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made a run for the door. But I had forgotten the exact position of the door, and struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either struck or struck myself against some other bulky furniture. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus to and fro in the darkness, of a cramped struggle, and of my own wild crying as I darted to and fro, of a heavy blow at last upon my forehead, a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered arm was watching my face. I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect. I turned to the corner and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue vial into a glass. "Where am I?" I asked. "I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are." They then told me, and I heard of the haunted red room as one who hears a tale. "We found you at dawn," said he, "and there was blood on your forehead and lips." It was very slowly I recovered my memory of my experience. "You believe now," said the old man, "that the room is haunted?" He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who grieves for a broken friend. "Yes," said I, "the room is haunted." "And you have seen it, and we, who have lived here all our lives, have never set eyes upon it, because we have never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old earl who—" "No," said I, "it is not." "I told you so," said the old lady, with the glass in her hand. "It is his poor young countess, who was frightened—" "It is not," I said. "There is neither ghost of earl nor ghost of countess in that room. There is no ghost at all, but worse, far worse." "Well," they said. "The worst of all the things that haunt poor mortal man," said I, "and that is, in all its nakedness, fear. Fear that will not have light nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkens and overwhelms. It followed me through the corridor. It fought against me in the room." I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. Then the man with the shade sighed and spoke. "That is it," said he. "I knew that was it. A power of darkness. To put such a curse upon a woman, it lurks there always. You can feel it, even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings, in the curtains, keeping behind you however you face about. In the dusk it creeps along the corridor and follows you, so that you dare not turn. There is fear in that room of hers, black fear, and there will be, so long as this house of sin endures." I love that story. That one's one of my favorites. And that's the kind of That's kind of the essence of so much of ghost stories and ghouls and goblins and witches and things like that. It's whether or not you believe those things are real, like that's neither here nor there. Um, the fear of those things, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the unseen. The human brain is such an amazing organ that even if, let's pretend none of those things are real, let's pretend the supernatural doesn't exist. There is a power in our minds that creates those things out of thin air. And I think in a crazy way, that's almost worse than if, let's say tomorrow, science was able to come out and say, we have for sure, without any sort of argumentable anything, have proved that the supernatural is real. Outside of that, it's in our hearts, it's in our minds collectively, culturally, socially. Fear, no matter what it looks like, is one of nature's most powerful forces. And I find that to be fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. But anyway, moving on to our next story. This one is by Bram Stoker. Yes, that Bram Stoker. Dracula, Bram Stoker. So I'm just going to read you the little, preamble here. Bram Stoker is the justly famous author of Dracula, the book which both defined and effectively ended the vampire horror novel, since no fantasist has ever written anything to surpass it on its own terms. Born in Dublin in 1847, Stoker lived a vigorous life as actor Henry Irving's personal manager, and wrote a small number of mostly weird novels and tales in his spare time. His first and perhaps rarest work of fiction was Under the Sunset, consisting of a series of darkly poetic episodes about the land of death, where the pale ghosts of the living may be sought. The Castle of the King is a self-contained chapter from that work, a bleak odyssey to the shores of night. It is astounding that the haunted Irishman thought he was writing the following tone poem for children. This is for children? I had no idea this was for children. Oh my god. So, the name of the story is The Castle of the King. That's like Hans Christian Andersen, like, and some of the old, like, kids' stories, they're really dark and really messed up. Disney has done a really great job of, like, dumbing all that stuff down and really making it palatable and fun for kids, because brace yourselves, imagine reading this to your children. Here we go. The Castle of the King by Bram Stoker. When they told the poor poet that the one he loved best was lying sick in the shadow of danger, he was nigh distraught. For weeks past he had been alone, she, his wife, having gone afar to her old home to see an aged grandsire ere he died. The poet's heart had for some days been oppressed with a strange sorrow. He did not know the cause of it. He only knew, with the deep sympathy which is the poet's gift, that the one he loved was sick. Anxiously had he awaited tidings. When the news came, the shock, although he expected a sad message, was too much for him, and he became nigh distraught, which means very upset. In his sadness and anxiety, he went out into the garden which long years he had cultured for her. There, amongst the bright flowers, where the old statues stood softly white against the hedges of yew, he lay down in the long uncut summer grass and wept with his head buried low. He thought of all the past, of how he had won his wife and how they loved each other, and to him it seemed a sad and cruel thing that she was afar and in danger, and he not near to comfort her, or even to share her pain. Many, many thoughts came back to him, telling the story of the weary years whose gloom and solitude he had forgotten in the brightness of his lovely home. How in youth they twain had met and in a moment loved, how his poverty and her greatness had kept them apart, how he had struggled and toiled in the steep and rugged road to fame and fortune, How all through the weary years he had striven with the single idea of winning such a place in the history of his time, that he should be able to come to her and say, "I love you," and to her proud relations, "I am worthy, for I too have become great." How, amid all this dreaming of a happy time which might come, he had kept silent as to his love. How he had never seen her or heard her voice, or even known her habitation, lest, knowing he should fail in the purpose of his life. How time, as it ever does to those who work with honesty and singleness of purpose, crowned the labors and the patience of his life. How the world had come to know his name and reverence and love it as of one who had helped the weak and weary by his example, who had purified the thoughts of all who listened to his words, and who had swept away baseness before the grandeur and simpleness of his noble thoughts. How success had followed in the wake of fame. How at length, even to his heart, timorous with the doubt of love, had been born the thought that he had at last achieved the greatness which justified him in seeking the hand of her he loved. How he had come back to his native place, and there found her still free. How when he had dared to tell her of his love, she had whispered to him that she, too, had waited all the years, for that she knew that he would come to claim her at the end. How she had come with him as his bride into the home which he had been making for her all these years. How there they had lived happily, and had dared to look into the long years to come for joy and content without a bar. How he thought that even then, when though somewhat enfeebled in strength by the ceaseless toil of years and the care of hoping, he might look to the happy time to come. But alas, for hope! For who knoweth what a day may bring forth? Only a little while ago his dear one had left him hale, departing in the cause of duty, and now she lay sick, and he not nigh to help her. All the sunshine of his life seemed to pass away, all the long years of waiting, and the patient continuance in well-doing, which had crowned their years with love, seemed but a passing dream, and was all in vain, all in vain. Now with the shadow hovering over his beloved one, the cloud seemed to be above and around them, and to hold in its dim recesses the doom of them both. Why, oh why, asked the poor poet to the viewless air, did love come to us? Why came peace and joy and happiness, if the darkening wings of peril shadow the air around her, and leave me to weep alone? Thus he moaned and raved and wept, and the bitter hours went by him in his solitude. As he lay in the garden with his face buried in the long grass, they came to him, and told him with weeping that tidings, sad indeed, had come. As they spoke, he lifted his poor head and gazed at them, and they saw in the great, dark, tender eyes that now he was quite distraught. He smiled at them sadly, as though not quite understanding the import of their words. As tenderly as they could, they tried to tell him that the one he loved best was dead. They said, "She has walked in the valley of the shadow," but he seemed to understand them not. They whispered, "She has heard the music of the spheres," but still he comprehended not. Then they spoke to him sorrowfully and said, "She now abides in the castle of the king." He looked at them eagerly, as if to ask, "What castle? What king?" They bowed their heads, and as they turned away weeping, they murmured to him softly, "The castle of the King of Death." He spake no word, so they turned their weeping faces to him again. They found that he had risen and stood with a set purpose on his face. Then he said sweetly, "I go to find her, that where she abideth, I too there abide." They said to him, "You cannot go. Beyond the portal she is, and in the land of death." Set purpose shone in the poet's earnest, loving eyes as he answered them for the last time. "Where she has gone, there I go too. Through the valley of the shadow shall I wend my way. In these ears also shall ring the music of the spheres. I shall seek, and I shall find my beloved in the halls of the castle of the king. I shall clasp her close, even before the dread face of the king of death." As they heard these words, they bowed their heads again and wept, and said, "Alas, alas!" The poet turned and left them, and passed away. They fain would have followed, but he motioned them that they should not stir. So, alone, in his grief, he went. As he passed on, he turned and waved his hand to them in farewell. Then for a while, with uplifted hand, he stood, and turned him slowly all around. Suddenly, his outstretched hand stopped and pointed. His friends, looking with him, saw where, away beyond the portal, the idle wilderness spread. There, in the midst of desolation, the mist from the marshes hung like a pall of gloom on the far-off horizon. As the poet pointed, there was a gleam of happiness. Very, very faint it was, in his poor, sad eyes, distraught with loss, as if afar he beheld some sign of hope of the lost one. Swiftly and sadly the poet fared on through the burning day. The rest time came, but on he journeyed. He paused not for shade or rest. Never, even for an instant, did he stop to cool his parched lips with an icy draught from the crystal springs. The weary wayfarers, resting in the cool shadows beside the fountains, raised their tired heads and looked at him with sleepy eyes as he hurried. He heeded them not, but went ever onward with set purpose in his eyes, as though some gleam of hope bursting through the mists of the distant marshes urged him on. So he fared on through all the burning day, and all the silent night. In the earliest dawn, when the promise of the still unrisen sun quickened the eastern sky into a pale light, he drew anigh the portal. The horizon stood out blackly in the cold morning light. There, as ever, stood the angels who kept watch and ward, and oh, wondrous, although invisible to human eyes, they were seen of him. As he drew nigh, they gazed at him pityingly, and swept their great wings out wide as if to shelter him. He spake, and from his troubled heart the sad words came sweetly through the pale lips. "Say, ye who guard the land, has my beloved one passed hither on the journey to the shadow of the valley of the king, to hear the music of the spheres, and to abide in the castle of the king?" The angels at the portal bowed their heads in token of assent, and they turned and looked outward from the land to where, far off in the idle wilderness, the dank mists crept from the lifeless bosom of the marsh. They knew well that the poor lonely poet was in quest of his beloved one. So they hindered him not, neither urged they him to stay. They pitied him much for what he had loved. They parted wide, that through the portal he might pass without let. So the poet went onwards into the idle desert to look for his beloved one in the castle of the king. For a time he went through gardens whose beauty was riper than the gardens of the land. The sweetness of all things stole on the senses like the odors of the isles of the blessed. The subtlety of the king of death, who rules in the realms of evil, is great. He has ordered that the way beyond the portal be made full of charm. Thus those straying from the paths ordained for good see around them much beauty, that in its joy the gloom and cruelty and guilt of the desert are forgotten. But as the poet passed onwards, the beauty began to fade away. The fair gardens looked as gardens do when the hand of care is taken off, and when the weeds in their hideous luxuriance choke, as they spring up, the choicer life of the flowers. From cool alleys under spreading branches, and from crisp sward which touched as soft as velvet the wanderer's aching feet, the way became a rugged stony path, full open to the burning glare. The flowers began to lose their odor, and to dwarf to stunted growth. Tall hemlocks rose on every side, infecting the air with their noisome odor. Great fungi grew in the dark hollows where the pools of dank water lay. Tall trees, with branches like skeletons, rose, trees which had no leaves, and under whose shadow to pause were to die. Then huge rocks barred the way. These were only passed by narrow, winding passages, overhung by the ponderous cliffs above. which ever threatened to fall and engulf the sojourner. Here the night began to fall, and the dim mist rising from the far-off marshes took weird shapes of gloom. In the distant fastness of the mountains the wild beasts began to roar in their cavern lairs. The air became hideous with the fell sounds of the night season. But the poor poet heeded not ill sights or sounds of dread. Onward he went ever, unthinking of the terrors of the night. To him there was no dread of darkness, no fear of death, no consciousness of horror. He sought his beloved one in the castle of the king, and in that eager quest all natural terrors were forgot. So fared he onward through the livelong night. Up the steep defiles he trod. Through the shadows of the huge rocks he passed unscathed. The wild animals came around him, roaring fiercely, their great eyes flaming like fiery stars through the blackness of the night. From the high rocks great pythons crawled and hung to seize their prey, from the crevices of the mountain steeps, and from cavernous rifts in the rocky way poisonous serpents glided and rose to strike. But close, though the noxious things came, they all refrained to attack, for they knew that the lonely sojourner was bound for the castle of their king. Onward still, onward he went, unceasing, pausing not in his course, but pressing ever forward in his quest. When daylight broke at last, the sun rose on a sorry sight. There, toiling on the rocky way, the poor lonely poet went ever onwards, unheeding of cold, or hunger, or pain. His feet were bare, and his footsteps on the rock-strewn way were marked by blood. Around and behind him, and afar off keeping equal pace on the summits of the rocky ridges, came the wild beasts that looked on him as their prey, but that refrained from touching him because he sought the castle of their king. In the air wheeled the obscene birds who follow ever on the track of the dying and the lost. Hovered the bare-necked vultures with eager eyes and hungry beaks. Their great wings flapped lazily in the idle air as they followed in the wanderer's track. The vultures are a patient folk, and they await the falling of the prey. From the cavernous recesses in the black mountain gorges crept with silent speed the serpents that there lurk. Came the python with his colossal folds and endless coils, whence looked forth cunningly the small flat head. Came the boa and all his tribe, which seized their prey by force and crush it with the dread strictness of their embrace. Came the hooded snakes, and all those with which their venom destroy their prey. Here, too, came those serpents most terrible of all to their quarry, which fascinate with the eyes of weird magic and by the slow gracefulness of their approach. Here came, or lay in wait, subtle snakes, which take the color of herb, or leaf, or dead branch, or slimy pool, amongst which they lurk, and so strike their prey unassuming. Great serpents there were, nimble of body, which hang from rock or branch. These, gripping tight to their distant hold, strike downward with the rapidity of light as they hurl their whip-like bodies from afar upon their prey. Thus came forth all these noxious things to meet the questing man, and to assail him. But when they knew he was bound for the dread castle of their king, and saw how he went onward without any fear, they abstained from attack. The deadly python and the boa towering aloft with colossal folds were passive, and for the nonce became as stone. The hooded serpents drew in again their venomous fangs. The mild, deep, earnest eyes of the fascinating snake became lurid with baffled spleen, as he felt his power to charm was without avail. In its deadly descent the hanging snake arrested its course, and hung a limp line from rock or branch. Many followed the wanderer onward into the desert wilds, waiting and hoping for a chance to destroy. Many other perils also were there for the poor wanderer in the desert idleness. As he went onward, the rocky way got steeper and darker. Lurid fogs and deadly chill mists arose. Then in this path along the trackless wilderness were strange and terrible things. Mandrakes, half plant, half man, shrieked at him with despairing cry, as, helpless for evil, they stretched out their ghastly arms in vain. Giant thorns arose in the path. They pierced his suffering feet and tore his flesh as onward he trod. He felt the pain, but he heeded it not. In all the long, terrible journey, he had but one idea other than his eager search for his beloved one. He thought that the children of men might learn much from the journey toward the castle of the king, which began so fair amidst the odorous gardens and under the cool shadow of the spreading trees. In his heart the poet spake to the multitude of the children of men, and from his lips the words flowed like music, for he sang of the golden gate, which the angels call truth. Pass not the portal of the sunset land. Pause where the angels at their vigils stand. Be warned, and press not through though the gates lie wide, but rest securely on the hither side. Though odorous gardens and cool ways invite, beyond our darkest valleys of the night, rest contented. Pause whilst undefiled, nor seek the horrors of the desert wild. Thus treading down all obstacles with his bleeding feet, passed ever onwards the poor distraught poet, to seek his beloved one in the castle of the king. Even as onward he went, the life that is of the animals seemed to die away behind him. The jackals and the more cowardly savage animals slunk away. The lions and tigers and bears and wolves and all the braver of the fierce beasts of prey which followed on his track, even after the others had stopped, now began to halt in their career. They growled low and then roared loudly with uplifted heads. The bristles of their mouths quivered with passion, and the great wide teeth champed angrily together in baffled rage. They went on a little further and stopped again, roaring and growling as before. Then one by one they ceased, and the poor poet went on alone. In the air the vultures wheeled and screamed, pausing and halting in their flight, as did the savage beasts. These, too, ceased at length to follow in the air the wanderer in his onward course. Longest of all kept up the snakes. With many a writhe and stealthy onward glide, they followed hard upon the footsteps of the questing man. In the blood marks of his feet upon the flinty rocks, they found a joy and hope, and they followed ever. But time came when the awful aspect of the places where the poet passed checked even the serpents in their track, the gloomy defiles whence issue the poisonous winds that sweep with desolation, even the dens of the beasts of prey, the sterile fastnesses which march upon the valleys of desolation. Here even the stealthy serpents paused in their course, and they too fell away. They glided back, smiling with deadliest rancor, to their obscene clefts. Then came places where plants and verdure began to cease. The very weeds became more and more stunted and inane. Farther on, they declined into the sterility of lifeless rock. Then the most noxious herbs that grew in ghastly shapes of gloom and terror lost even the power to harm, which outlives their living growth. Dwarfed and stunted even of evil, they were compact of the dead rock. Here even the deadly upas tree could strike no root into the pestiferous earth. Then came places where, in the entrance to the valley of the shadow, even solid things lost their substance, and melted in the dank and cold mists which swept along. As he passed, the distraught poet could feel not solid earth under his bleeding feet. On shadows he walked, and amid them, onward through the valley of the shadow to seek his beloved one in the castle of the king. The valley of the shadow seemed of endless expanse, circled by the teeming mist. No eye could pierce to where rose the great mountains between which the valley lay. Yet they stood there, Mount Despair on the one hand, and the Hill of Fear upon the other. Hitherto the poor bewildered brain of the poet had taken no note of all the dangers and horrors and pains which surrounded him, save only for the lesson which they taught. But now, lost as he was in the shrouding vapor of the valley of the shadow, he could not but think of the terrors of the way. He was surrounded by grisly phantoms that ever and anon rose silent in the mist, and were lost again before he could catch to the full their dread import. Then there flashed across his soul a terrible thought. Could it be possible that hither his beloved one had travelled? Had there come to her the pains which shook his own form with agony? Was it indeed necessary that she should have been appalled by all these surrounding horrors? At the thought of her, his beloved one, suffering with such pain and dread, he gave forth one bitter cry that rang through the solitude, that cleft the vapor of the valley, and echoed in the caverns of the mountains of fear and despair. The wild cry, prolonged with the agony of the poet's soul, rang through the valley, till the shadows that peopled it woke for the moment into life in death. They flitted dimly along, now melting away and anon springing again into life, till all the valley of the shadow was for once peopled with quickening ghosts. Oh, in that hour there was agony to the poor distraught poet's soul, but presently there came a calm. When the rush of his first agony passed, the poet knew that to the dead came not the horrors of the journey that he undertook. To the quick alone is the horror of the passage to the castle of the king. With the thought came to him such peace that even there, in the dark valley of the shadow, stole soft music that sounded in the desert gloom like the music of the spheres. Then the poor poet remembered what they had told him, that his beloved one had walked through the valley of the shadow, that she had known the music of the spheres, and that she abode in the castle of the king. So he thought that as he was now in the valley of the shadow, and as he heard the music of the spheres, that soon he should see the castle of the king where his beloved one abode. Thus he went on in hope. But alas, that very hope was a new pain that ere this he wot not of. Hitherto he had gone on blindly, recking not of where he went, or what came anigh him, so long as he pressed onward on his quest. But now the darkness and the peril of the way had new terrors, for he thought of how they might arrest his course. Such thoughts made the way long indeed, for the moment seemed an age with hoping. Eagerly he sought for the end to come, when, beyond the valley of the shadow through which he fared, he should see rising the turrets of the castle of the king. Despair seemed to grow upon him, and as it grew there rang out, ever louder, the music of the spheres. Onward, ever onward, hurried in mad haste the poor distraught poet. The dim shadows that peopled the mist shrank back as he passed, extending toward him warning hands with long, gloomy fingers of deadly cold. In the bitter silence of the moment they seemed to say, "Go back, go back." Louder and louder now rang the music of the spheres. Faster and faster, in mad, feverish haste, rushed the poet, amid the shrinking shadows of the gloomy valley. The peopling shadows, as they faded away before him, seemed to wail in sorrowful warning, "Go back, go back." Still in his ears rang the ever-swelling tumult of the music. Faster and faster he rushed onward, till at last wearied nature gave way, and he fell prone to earth, senseless, bleeding, and alone. After a time, how long he could not even guess, he awoke from his swoon. For a while he could not think where he was, and his scattered senses could not help him. All was gloom and cold and darkness. A solitude reigned around him, more deadly than aught he had ever dreamt of. No breeze was in the air, no movement of a passing cloud, no voice or stir of living thing in earth or water or air, no rustle of leaf or sway of branch. All was silent, dead, and deserted. Amid the eternal hills of gloom around lay the valley devoid of aught that lived or grew. The sweeping mists, with their multitude of peopling shadows, had gone by. The fearsome terrors of the desert even were not there. The poet, as he gazed around him, in his utter loneliness, longed for the sweep of the storm or the roar of the avalanche to break the dread horror of the silent gloom. Then the poet knew that through the valley of the shadow had he come, that scared and maddened though he had been, he had heard the music of the spheres. He thought that now hard by the desolate king, He thought that now, hard by the desolate kingdom of death he trod. He gazed all around him, fearing lest he should see anywhere the dread castle of the king, where his beloved one abode, and he groaned as the fear of his heart found voice. Not here, oh, not here, amid this awful solitude. Then amid the silence around, upon the distant hills, his words echoed, Not here, oh, not here, till with the echoing and re-echoing rock, the idle wilderness was peopled with voices. Suddenly, the echo voices ceased. From the lurid sky broke the terrible sound of the thunder peal. Along the distant skies it rolled. Far away over the endless ring of the gray horizon it swept, going and returning, pealing, swelling, dying away. It traversed the ether, muttering now in ominous sound as of threats, and anon crashing with the voice of dread command. In its roar came a sound as of a word. Onward! To his knees the poet sank and welcomed with tears of joy the sound of the thunder. It swept away as a power from above the silent desolation of the wilderness. It told him that in and above the valley of the shadow rolled the mighty tones of heaven's command. Then the poet rose to his feet, and with new heart went onwards into the wilderness. As he went, the roll of the thunder died away, and again the silence of desolation reigned alone. So time wore on, but never came rest to the weary feet. Onwards, still onwards he went, with but one memory to cheer him, the echo of the thunder roll in his ears as it pealed out in the valley of desolation. Onward, onward. Now the road became less and less rocky, as on his way he passed. The great cliffs sank and dwindled away, and the ooze of the fens crept upward to the mountain's feet. At length the hills and hollows of the mountain fastness disappeared. The wanderer took his way amid mere trackless wastes, where was nothing but quaking marsh and slime. On he wandered, stumbling blindly with weary feet on the endless road. Over his soul crept ever closer the blackness of despair, whilst amid the mountain gorges he had been wandering, some small cheer came from the hope that at any moment some turn in the path might show him his journey's end. Some entry from a dark defile might expose to him, looming great in the distance, or even anigh him, the dread castle of the king. But now with the flat desolation of the silent marsh around him, he knew that the castle could not exist without his seeing it. He stood for a while erect and turned him slowly round, so that the complete circuit of the horizon was swept by his eager eyes. Alas! Never a sight did he see. Naught was there but the black line of the horizon, where the sad earth lay against the level sky. All was compact of a silent gloom. Still on he tottered. His breath came fast and labored. His weary limbs quivered as they bore him feebly up. His strength, his life, was ebbing fast. On he hurried, ever on, with one idea desperately fixed in his poor, distraught mind, that in the castle of the king he should find his beloved one. He stumbled and fell. There was no obstacle to arrest his feet. Only from his own weakness he declined. Quickly he arose and went onward with flying feet. He dreaded that he should fall might he not be able to rise again. Again he fell. Again he rose and went on his way desperately, with blind purpose. So for a while he went onwards, stumbling and falling, but arising ever and pausing not on his way. His quest he followed, of his beloved one abiding in the castle of the king. At last so weak he grew that when he sank he was unable to rise again. Feebler and feebler he grew as he lay prone, and over his eager eyes came the film of death. But even then came comfort, for he knew that his race was run, and that soon he would meet his beloved one in the halls of the castle of the king. To the wilderness his thoughts he spoke. His voice came forth with a feeble sound, like the moaning before a storm of wind as it passes through reeds in the gray autumn. A little longer. Soon I shall meet her in the halls of the king, and we shall part no more. For this it is worth to pass through the valley of the shadow, and to listen to the music of the spheres with their painful hope. What boots What boots it though the castle be afar? Quickly speed the feet of the dead. To the fleeting spirit all distance is but a span. I fear not now to see the castle of the king, for there, within its chiefest hall, soon I shall meet my beloved, to part no more. Even as he spoke, he felt that the end was nigh. Forth from the marsh before him crept a still, spreading mist. It rose silently, higher, higher, enveloping the wilderness for far around. It took deeper and darker shades as it rose. It was as though the spirit of gloom were hid within, and grew mightier with the spreading vapor. To the eyes of the dying poet, the creeping mist was as a shadowy castle. Arose the tall turrets and the frowning keep. The gateway, with its cavernous recesses and its beetling towers, took shape as a skull. The distant battlements towered aloft into the silent air. From the very ground whereon the stricken poet lay, grew, dim and dark, a vast causeway leading into the gloom of the castle's gate. The dying poet raised his head and looked, his fast failing eyes, quickened by the love and hope of his spirit, pierced through the dark walls of the keep and the gloomy terrors of the gateway. There, within the great hall, where the grim King of Terrors himself holds his court, he saw her whom he sought. She was standing in the ranks of those who wait in patience for their beloved to follow them into the land of death. The poet knew that he had but a little while to wait, and he was patient, stricken though he lay, amongst the eternal solitudes. Afar off, beyond the distant horizon, came a faint light, as of the dawn of a coming day. As it grew brighter, the castle stood out more and more clearly, till in the quickening dawn it stood revealed in all its cold expanse. The dying poet knew that the end was at hand. With a last effort he raised himself to his feet, that standing erect and bold as is the right of manhood, he might so meet face to face the grim King of Death before the eyes of his beloved one. The distant sun of the coming day rose over the horizon's edge. A ray of light shot upward. As it struck the summit of the castle keep, the poet's spirit in an instant of time swept along the causeway. Through the ghostly portal of the castle it swept, and met with joy the kindred spirit that it loved before the very face of the King of Death. Quicker than the lightning's flash, the whole castle melted into nothingness, and the sun of the coming day shone calmly upon the eternal solitudes. In the land within the portal rose the sun of the coming day. It shone calmly and brightly on a fair garden, where, among the long summer grass, lay the poet, colder than the marble statues around him. Mind you, that was a child's story. That was a kid's story. They raised kids real different back then. Like, holy cow. Oh my gosh. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. We have one final story for our Halloween read, and I hope you guys have enjoyed yourselves as much as I have. This is by the famous Charles Dickens, The Tale of the Bagman's Uncle. And I'll just go ahead and read you just a little snippet of some background for this. The year 1812 was famous for yet another bloody war, but it also saw the birth of Charles Dickens, who, in spite of critical backlash, may well endure as England's greatest novelist. His deprived childhood and difficult mature years found echoes in his darker pages, many of which were devoted to the ghostly. But The Tale of the Bagman's Uncle is a thoroughly high-spirited romp, a dashing tale of swashbuckling ghosts that ends in a devastating punchline. How very Dickensian, indeed. The Tale of the Bagman's Uncle, by Charles Dickens. My uncle, gentlemen, said the bagman, was one of the merriest, pleasantest, cleverest fellows that ever lived. I wish you had known him, gentlemen. On second thoughts, gentlemen, I don't wish you had known him, for if you had, you would have been all, by this time, in the ordinary course of nature, if not dead, at all events so to hear it, as to have taken to stopping at home and giving up company. which would have deprived me of the inestimable pleasure of addressing you at this moment. Gentlemen, I wish your fathers and mothers had known my uncle. They would have been amazingly fond of him, especially your respectable mothers. I know they would. If any two of his numerous virtues predominated over the many that adorned his character, I should say they were his mixed punch and his after-supper song. Excuse my dwelling on these melancholy recollections of departed worth. You won't see a man like my uncle every day in the week. I have always considered it a great point in my uncle's character, gentlemen, that he was the intimate friend and companion of Tom Smart, of the great house of Bilson and Slum, Caton Street, City. My uncle collected for Tiggin and Whelps, but for a long time he went pretty near the same journey as Tom, and for the very first night they met, my uncle took a fancy for Tom, and Tom took a fancy for my uncle. They made a bet of a new hat before they had known each other half an hour, who should brew the best quart of punch and drink it the quickest. My uncle was judged to have won the making, but Tom Smart beat him in the drinking by about a half a salt-spoonful. They took another quart apiece to drink each other's health in, and were staunch friends ever afterwards. There's a destiny in these things, gentlemen. We can't help it. In personal appearance, my uncle was a trifle shorter than the middle size. He was a thought stouter, too, than the ordinary run of people, and perhaps his face might be a shade redder. He had the jolliest face you ever saw, gentlemen, something like Punch, with a handsomer nose and chin. His eyes were always twinkling and sparkling with good humor, and a smile, not one of your unmeaning wooden grins, but a real, merry, hearty, good-tempered smile, was perpetually on his countenance. He was pitched out of his gig once, and knocked head first against a milestone. There he lay, stunned, and so cut about the face with some gravel which had been heaped up alongside it, that, to use my uncle's own strong expression, if his mother could have revisited the earth, she wouldn't have known him. Indeed, when I come to think of the matter, gentlemen, I feel pretty sure she wouldn't, for she died when my uncle was 2 and 7 months old, and I think it's very likely that, even without the gravel, his top boots would have puzzled the good lady not a little, to say nothing of his jolly red face. However, there he lay, and I have heard my uncle say, many a time, that the man said who picked him up that he was smiling as merrily as if he had tumbled out for a treat, and that after they had bled him, the first faint glimmerings of returning animation were his jumping up in bed, bursting out into a loud laugh, kissing the young woman who held the basin, and demanding a mutton chop and a pickled walnut. He was very fond of pickled walnuts, gentlemen. He said he always found that, taken without vinegar, they relished the beer. My uncle's great journey was in the fall of the leaf, at which time he collected debts, and took orders in the north, going from London to Edinburgh, from Edinburgh to Glasgow, from Glasgow back to Edinburgh, and thence to London by the smack. You are to understand that his second visit to Edinburgh was for his own pleasure. He used to go back for a week, just to look up his old friends, and what with breakfasting with this one, lunching with that, dining with a third, and supping with another, a pretty tight week he used to make of it. I don't know whether any of you, gentlemen, ever partook of a real substantial, hospitable Scotch breakfast, and then went out to a slight lunch of a bushel of oysters, a dozen or so of bottled ale, and a noggin or two of whiskey to close up with. If ever you did, you will agree with me that it requires a pretty strong head to go out to dinner and supper afterwards. But, bless your hearts and eyebrows, all this sort of thing was nothing to my uncle. He was so well seasoned that it was mere child's play. I've heard him say that he could see the Dundee people out any day, and walk home afterwards without staggering. And yet the Dundee people have as strong heads and as strong punch, gentlemen, as you are likely to meet with between the poles. I have heard of a Glasgow man and a Dundee man drinking against each other for 15 hours at a sitting. They were both suffocated, as nearly as could be ascertained at the same moment, but with this trifling exception, gentlemen, they were not a bit the worse for it. One night, within 24 hours of the time when he had settled to take shipping for London, my uncle supped at the house of a very old friend of his, a Bailey Mac something, that 4 syllables after it, who lived in the town of Edinburgh. There were the Bailey's wife, and the Bailey's 3 daughters, and the Bailey's grown-up son, and 3 or 4 stout, bushy-eye-browed, canny old Scotch fellows that the Bailey had got together to do honour to my uncle, and to help make merry. It was a glorious supper. There were kippered salmon, and finnan haddocks, and a lamb's head, and a haggis, a celebrated Scotch dish, gentlemen, which my uncle used to say always looked to him, when it came to the table, very much like a Cupid's stomach, and that a very great many other things besides that I forget the names of, but very good things notwithstanding. The lassies were pretty and agreeable, and the Bailey's wife was one of the best creatures that ever lived, and my uncle was in thoroughly good cue. The consequence of which was, that the young ladies tittered and giggled, and the old lady laughed out loud, and the Bailey and the other old fellows roared till they were red in the face, the whole mortal time. I don't quite recollect how many tumblers of whiskey toddy each man drank after supper, but this I know, that about 1 o'clock in the morning the Bailey's grown-up son became insensible while attempting the first verse of Willie Brewed a Speck-o-Mott, and he having been for half an hour before the only other man visible above the mahogany, it occurred to my uncle that it was almost time to think about going, especially as drinking had set in at 7 o'clock, in order that he might get home at a decent hour. But, thinking it might not be quite polite to go just then, my uncle voted himself into the chair, mixed another glass, rose to propose his own health, addressed himself in a neat and contemporary speech, and drank the toast with great enthusiasm. Still nobody woke, so much my uncle took a little drop more, neat this time, to prevent the toddy from disagreeing with him, and, laying violent hands on his hat, sallied forth into the street. It was a wild gusty night when my uncle closed the Bailey's door, and settling his hat firmly on his head, to prevent the wind from taking it, thrust his hands into his pockets, and looking upward, took a short survey of the state of the weather. The clouds were drifting over the moon at their giddiest speed, at one time wholly obscuring her, at another suffering her to burst forth in full splendor, and shed her light on all the objects around, anon driving over her again with increased velocity, and shrouding everything in darkness. Really, this won't do, said my uncle, addressing himself to the weather, as if he felt himself personally offended. This is not at all the kind of thing for my voyage. It will not do at any price, said my uncle very impressively. Having repeated this several times, he recovered his balance with some difficulty, for he was rather giddy with looking up into the sky so long, and walked merrily on. The Bailey's house was in the Canongate, and my uncle was going to the other end of Leith Walk, rather better than a mile's journey. On either side of him there shot up against the dark sky tall, gaunt, strangling houses with time-stained fronts, and windows that seemed to have shared the lot of eyes in mortals, and to have grown dim and sunken with age. 6, 7, 8 stories high were the houses, story piled above story, as children build with cards, throwing their dark shadows over the roughly paved road, and making the dark night darker. A few oil lamps were scattered along distances, but they only served to mark the dirty entrance of some narrow close, or to show where a common stair communicated, by steep and intricate windings, with the various flats above. Glancing at all these things, with the air of a man who had seen them too often before, to think them worthy of much notice now, my uncle walked up the middle of the street, with a thumb in each waistcoat pocket, indulging from time to time in various snatches of song, chaunted forth with such good will and spirit that the quiet, honest folk started from their first sleep and lay trembling in bed till the sound died away in the distance, when, satisfying themselves that it was only some drunken ne'er-do-well finding his way home, they covered themselves up warm and fell asleep again. I am particular in describing how my uncle walked up the middle of the street, with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, gentlemen, because, as he often used to say, and with great reason too, there is nothing at all extraordinary in this story, unless you distinctly understand that at the beginning that he was not by any means of a marvelous or romantic turn. Gentlemen, My uncle walked on with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, taking the middle of the street to himself, and singing now a verse of a love song, and then a verse of a drinking one, and when he was tired of both, whistling melodiously, until he reached the North Bridge, which, at this point, connects the old and new towns of Edinburgh. Here he stopped for a minute, to look at the strange, irregular clusters of lights piled above one another, and twinkling afar off so high that they looked like stars, gleaming from the castle walls on the one side and the Calton Hill on the other, as if they illuminated veritable castles in the air, while the old picturesque town slept heavily on, in gloom and darkness below, its palace and chapel of Holyrood, guarded day and night, as a friend of my uncle's used to say, by old Arthur's Seat, towering surly and dark like some gruff genius over the ancient city he had watched so long. I say, gentlemen, that my uncle stopped here for a minute to look about him, and then, paying a compliment to the weather, which had a little cleared up, though the moon was sinking, walked on again, as royally as before, keeping the middle of the road with great dignity, and looking as if he would very much like to meet with somebody who would dispute possession of it with him. There was nobody at all disposed to contest the point, as it happened, and so on he went, with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, like a lamb. When my uncle reached the end of Leith Walk, he had to cross a pretty large piece of waste ground which separated him from a short street, which he had to turn down, to go direct to his lodging. Now in this piece of waste ground there was, at that time, an enclosure belonging to some wheelwright who contracted with the post office for the purchase of old worn-out mail coaches, and my uncle, being very fond of coaches, old, young, or middle-aged, all at once took it into his head to step out of his road for no other purpose than to peep between the palings at these mails, about a dozen of which he remembered to have seen crowded together in a very forlorn and dismantled state inside. My uncle was a very enthusiastic, emphatic sort of person, gentlemen, so, finding that he could not obtain a good peep between the pallings, he got over them, and sitting himself quietly down on an old axle-tree, began to contemplate the mail coaches with a great deal of gravity. There might be a dozen of them, or there might be more. My uncle was never quite certain on this point, and being a man of very scrupulous veracity about numbers, didn't like to say, but there they stood, all huddled together in the most desolate condition imaginable. The doors had been torn from their hinges and removed, the linings had been stripped off, only a shred hanging here and there by a rusty nail. The lamps were gone, the poles had long since vanished, the ironwork was rusty, the paint was worn away. The wind whistled through the chinks in the bare woodwork, and the rain, which had collected on the roofs, fell, drop by drop, into the insides with a hollow and melancholy sound. They were the decaying skeletons of departed mails. That in the lonely place, at that time of night, they looked chill and dismal. My uncle rested his head upon his hands, and thought of the busy, bustling people who had rattled about, years before, in the old coaches, and were now as silent and changed. He thought of the numbers of people to whom one of those crazy, mouldering vehicles had borne, night after night for many years, and through all weathers, the anxiously expected intelligence, the eagerly looked-for remittance, the promised assurance of health and safety, the sudden announcement of sickness and death, the merchant, the lover, the wife, the widow, the mother, the schoolboy, the very child who tottered to the door at the postman's knock. How they had all looked forward to the arrival of the old coach, and where were they all now? Gentlemen, my uncle used to say that he thought all this at the time, but I rather suspect he learnt it out of some book afterwards, for he distinctly stated that he fell into a kind of doze, and as he sat on the old axle-tree, looking at the decayed mail coaches, and that he was suddenly awakened by some deep church bell striking too. Now my uncle was never a fast thinker, and if he had thought all these things, I am quite certain it would have taken him till full 2:30 at the very least. I am, therefore, decidedly of opinion, gentlemen, that my uncle fell into the kind of doze, without having thought about anything at all. Be this as it may, A church bell struck 2. My uncle woke, rubbed his eyes, and jumped up in astonishment. In one instant after the clock struck 2, the whole of this deserted and quiet spot had become a scene of extraordinary life and animation. The mail coach doors were on their hinges, the lining was replaced, the ironwork was as good as new, the paint was restored, the lamps were alight, cushions and great coats were on every coach box, porters were thrusting parcels into every boot, guards were stowing away letter bags, holsters were dashing pails of water against the renovated wheels, numbers of men were rushing about, fixing poles into every coach. Passengers arrived, portmanteaus were handed up, horses were put to. In short, it was perfectly clear that every mail there was to be off directly. Gentlemen, my uncle opened his eyes so wide at all this that to the very last moment of his life he used to wonder how it fell out that he had ever been able to shut him again. "Now then," said a voice, as my uncle felt a hand on his shoulder, "you're booked for one inside. You'd better get in." "I booked?" said my uncle, turning round. "Yes, certainly." My uncle, gentlemen, could say nothing. He was so very much astonished. The queerest thing of all was that although there was such a crowd of persons, and although fresh faces were pouring in every moment, there was no telling where they came from. They seemed to start up in some strange manner from the ground or the air, and disappear in the same way. When a porter had put his luggage in the coach, and received his fare, he turned round and was gone, and before my uncle had well begun to wonder what had become of him, half a dozen fresh ones started up, and staggered along under the weight of parcels which seemed big enough to crush them. The passengers were all dressed, so oddly too. Large, broad-skirted laced coats with great cuffs and no collars, and wigs, gentlemen, great formal wigs with a tie behind. My uncle could make nothing of it. "Now, are you going to get in?" said the person who had addressed my uncle before. He was dressed as a mail guard, with a wig on his head and most enormous cuffs to his coat, and had a lantern in one hand and a huge blunderbuss in the other, which he was going to stow away in his little armrest. "Are you going to get in, Jack Martin?" said the guard, holding the lantern to my uncle's face. "Hallo!" said my uncle, falling back a step or two. "That's familiar." "It's so on the way-bill," replied the guard. "Isn't there a Mr. before it?" said my uncle, for he felt, gentlemen, that for a guard he didn't know to call him Jack Martin was a liberty which the post office wouldn't have sanctioned if they had known it. "No, there is not," rejoined the guard coolly. "Is the fare paid?" inquired my uncle. "Of course it is," rejoined the guard. "It is it?" said my uncle. "Then here goes. Which coach?" "This," said the guard, pointing to an old-fashioned Edinburgh and London mail, which had the steps down and the door open. "Stop! Here are the other passengers. Let them get in first." As the guard spoke, there all at once appeared, right in front of my uncle, a young gentleman in a powdered wig, and a sky-blue coat trimmed with silver, made very full and broad in the skirts, which were lined with buckram. Tiggin and whelps were in the printed calico and waistcoat piece-line, gentlemen, so my uncle knew all the materials at once. He wore knee-breeches, and a kind of leggings rolled up over his silk stockings, and shoes with buckles. He had ruffles at his wrists, a three-cornered hat on his head, and a long taper sword by his side. The flaps of his waistcoat came halfway down his thighs, and the end of his cravat reached to his waist. He stalked gravely to the coach door, pulled off his hat, held it above his head at arm's length, cocking his finger in the air at the same time, as some affected people do when they take a cup of tea. When he drew his feet together and made a low, grave bow, and then put out his left hand, my uncle was just going to step forward and shake it heartily, but when he perceived that these attentions were directed not towards him, but to a young lady who had just appeared at the foot of the steps, attired in an old-fashioned green velvet dress, with a long waist and stomacher. She had no bonnet on her head, gentlemen, which was muffled in a black silk hood, but she looked round for an instant as she prepared to get in the coach, and such a beautiful face as she disclosed my uncle had never seen, not even in a picture. She got into the coach, holding up her dress with one hand, and, as my uncle always said with a round oath, when he told the story. He wouldn't have believed it possible that legs and feet could have been brought to such a state of perfection unless he had seen them with his own eyes. But in this one glimpse of the beautiful face, my uncle saw that the young lady cast an imploring look upon him, and that she appeared terrified. She appeared terrified and distressed. He noticed, too, that the young fellow in the powdered wig, notwithstanding his show of gallantry, which was all very fine and grand, clasped her tight by the wrist when she got in, and followed himself immediately afterwards. An uncommonly ill-looking fellow, in a close brown wig and a plum-colored suit, wearing a very large sword and boots up to his hips, belonged to the party. And when he sat himself down next to the young lady, who shrunk into a corner at his approach, my uncle was confirmed in his original impression that something dark and mysterious was going forward, or, as he always said himself, that there was a screw loose somewhere. It's quite surprising how quickly he made up his mind to help the lady at any peril, if she needed help. "Death and lightning!" exclaimed the young gentleman, laying his hand upon his sword as my uncle entered the coach. "Blood and thunder!" roared the other gentleman. With this, he whipped his sword out, and made a lunge at my uncle without further ceremony. My uncle had no weapon about him, but with great dexterity he snatched the ill-looking gentleman's three-cornered hat from his head, and receiving the point of his sword right through the crown, squeezed the sides together and held it tight. "Pink him behind!" cried the ill-looking gentleman to his companion, as he struggled to regain his sword. "He had better not!" cried my uncle, displaying the heel of one of his shoes in a threatening manner. "I'll kick his brains out, if he has any, or fracture his skull if he hasn't." Exerting all his strength at this moment, my uncle wrenched the ill-looking man's sword from his grasp, and flung it clean out of the coach window. Upon which the younger gentleman vociferated, "Death and lightning!" again, and laid his hand upon the hilt of his sword in a very fierce manner, but didn't draw it. Perhaps, gentlemen, as my uncle used to say with a smile, perhaps he was afraid of alarming the lady. "Now, gentlemen," said my uncle, taking his seat deliberately, "I don't want to have any death, with or without lightning, in a lady's presence, and we have had quite blood and thundering enough for one journey. So, if you please, we'll sit in our places like quiet insides. Here, guard, pick up that gentleman's carving knife." As quickly as my uncle said the words, the guard appeared at the coach window with the gentleman's sword in his hand. He held up his lantern and looked earnestly in my uncle's face as he handed it in, when by its light my uncle saw to his great surprise that an immense crowd of mail coach guards swarmed round the window, every one whom had his eyes earnestly fixed upon him too. He had never seen such a sea of white faces, red bodies, and earnest eyes in all his born days. "This is the strangest sort of thing I have ever had anything to do with," thought my uncle. "Allow me to return you your hat, sir." The ill-looking gentleman received his three-cornered hat in silence, looked at the hole in the middle with an inquiring air, and finally stuck it on top of his wig with a solemnity the effect of which was a trifle impaired by his sneezing violently at the moment, and jerking it off again. "All right," cried the guard with the lantern, mounting into his little seat behind. Away they went. My uncle peeped out of the coach window as they emerged from the yard, and observed that the other mails, with coachmen, guards, horses, and passengers complete, were driving round and round in circles, at a slow trot of about 5 miles in an hour. My uncle burnt with indignation, gentlemen. As a commercial man, he felt that the mail bags were not to be trifled with, and he resolved to memorialize the post office on the subject, with the very instant he reached London. At present, however, his thoughts were occupied with the young lady, who sat in the farthest corner of the coach, with her face muffled closely in her hood. The gentleman with the sky-blue coat sitting opposite to her, the other man in the plum-colored suit by her side, and both watching her intently. If she so much as rustled the folds of her hood, he could hear the ill-looking man clap his hand upon his sword, and could tell by the other's breathing — it was so dark he couldn't see his face — that he was looking as big as if he were going to devour her at a mouthful. This roused my uncle more and more, and he resolved, come what might, to see the end of it. He had a great admiration for bright eyes and sweet faces, and pretty legs and feet. In short, he was fond of the whole sex. Gender. It runs in our family, gentlemen. So am I. Many were the devices which my uncle practised, to attract the lady's attention, or at all events to engage the mysterious gentleman in conversation. They were all in vain. The gentleman wouldn't talk, and the lady didn't dare. He thrust his head out of the coach window at intervals, and bawled out to know why they didn't go faster, but he called till he was hoarse. Nobody paid the least attention to him. He leaned back in the coach and thought of the beautiful face, and the feet and legs. This answered better. It whiled away the time, and kept him from wondering where he was going, and how it was that he found himself in such an odd situation. Not that this would have worried him much, anyway. He was a mighty free and easy, roving, devil-may-care sort of person, was my uncle gentleman. All of a sudden the coach stopped. "Hullo!" said my uncle. "What's in the wind now?" "A light here," said the guard, letting down the steps. "Here!" cried my uncle. "Here," rejoined the guard. "I'll do nothing of the sort," said my uncle. "Very well, then stop where you are," said the guard. "I will," said my uncle. "Do," said the guard. The other passengers had regarded this colloquy with great attention. I struggle with that word. And finding that my uncle was determined not to alight, the younger man squeezed past him to hand the lady out. At this moment the ill-looking man was inspecting the hole in the crown of his three-cornered hat. As the young lady brushed past, she dropped one of her gloves into my uncle's hand and softly whispered, with her lips so close to his face that he felt her warm breath on his nose, the single word, "Help." Gentlemen, my uncle leapt out of the coach at once, with such violence that it rocked on the springs again. "Oh, you've thought better of it, have you?" said the guard, when he saw my uncle standing on the ground. My uncle looked at the guard for a few seconds, in some doubt whether it wouldn't be better to wrench his blunderbuss from him, fire it in the face of the man with the big sword, knock the rest of the company over the head with the stock, snatch up the young lady, and go off in the smoke. On second thoughts, however, he abandoned this plan as being a shade too melodramatic in the execution, and followed the two mysterious men, who, keeping the lady between them, were now entering an old house in front of which the coach had stopped. They turned into the passage, and my uncle followed. Of all the ruinous and desolate places my uncle had ever beheld, this was the most so. It looked as if it had once been a large house of entertainment, but the roof had fallen in many places, and the stairs were steep, rugged, and broken. There was a huge fireplace in the room into which they walked, and the chimney was blackened with smoke, but no warm blaze lighted it up now. The white feathery dust of burnt wood was still strewed over the hearth, but the stove was cold, and all was dark and gloomy. "Well," said my uncle, as he looked about him, "a mail travelling at the rate of 6 miles and half an hour, and stopping for an indefinite time at such a hole as this, is rather an irregular sort of proceeding, I fancy. This shall be made known. I'll write to the papers." My uncle said this in a pretty loud voice, and in an open, unreserved sort of manner, with the view of engaging the two strangers in conversation if he could. But neither of them took any more notice of him than whispering to each other, and scowling at him as they did so. The lady was at the farther end of the room, and once she ventured to wave her hand, as if beseeching my uncle's assistance. At length the two passengers advanced a little, and the conversation began in earnest. "You don't know this is a private room, I suppose, fellow?" said the gentleman in sky blue. "No, I do not, fellow," rejoined my uncle. "Only if this is a private room specially ordered for the occasion, I should think the public room must be a very comfortable one." With this my uncle sat himself down in a high-backed chair, and took such an accurate measure of the gentleman with his eyes that Tiggin and Welps could have supplied him with printed calico for a suit, and not an inch too much or too little, from that estimate alone. "Quit this room," said both men together, grasping their swords. "Eh?" said my uncle, not at all appearing to comprehend their meaning. "Quit the room, or you are a dead man," said the ill-looking fellow with the large sword, drawing it at the same time and flourishing it in the air. "Down with him!" cried the gentleman in sky blue, drawing his sword also, and falling back 2 or 3 yards. "Down with him!" The lady gave a loud scream. Now my uncle was always remarkable for great boldness and great presence of mind. All the time that he had appeared so indifferent to what was going on, he had been looking slyly about for some missile or weapon of defense, and at the very instant when the swords were drawn, he espied, standing at the chimney corner, an old basket-hilted rapier in a rusty scabbard. At one bound my uncle caught it in his hand, drew it, flourished it gallantly above his head, called aloud to the lady to keep out of the way, hurled the chair at the man in sky blue, and the scabbard at the man in plum color, and taking advantage of the confusion, fell upon them both pell-mell. Gentlemen, there is an old story, none the worse for being true, regarding a fine young Irish gentleman, who being asked if he could play the fiddle, replied he had no doubt he could, but he couldn't exactly say for certain, because he had never tried. This is not inapplicable to my uncle and his fencing. He had never had a sword in his hand before, except once when he played Richard III at a private theatre, upon which occasion it was arranged with Richmond that he was to be run through from behind, without showing fight at all. But here he was, cutting and slashing with two experienced swordsmen, thrusting and guarding and poking and slicing, and acquitting himself in the most manful and dexterous manner possible, although up to that time he had never been aware that he had the least notion of the science. It only shows how true the old saying is, that a man never knows what he can do till he tries, gentlemen. The noise of the combat was terrific, each of the three combatants swearing like troopers, and their swords clashing with as much noise as if all the knives and steels in Newport Market were rattling together at the same time. When it was at its very height, the lady, to encourage my uncle most probably, withdrew her hood entirely from her face, and disclosed a countenance of such dazzling beauty that he would have fought against 50 men to win one smile from it and die. He had done wonders before, but now he began to powder away like a raving mad giant. At this very moment the gentleman in sky blue, turning round, and seeing the young lady with her face uncovered, vented an exclamation of rage and jealousy, and, turning his weapon against her beautiful bosom, pointed a thrust at her heart, which caused my uncle to utter a cry of apprehension that made the building ring. The lady stepped lightly aside, and snatching the young man's sword from his hand, before he had recovered his balance, drove him to the wall, and running it through him, and the paneling, up to the very hilt, pinned him there hard and fast. It was a splendid example. My uncle, with a loud shout of triumph, and a strength that was irresistible, made his adversary retreat in the same direction, and plunging the old rapier into the very center of a large red flower in the pattern of his waistcoat, nailed him beside his friend. There they both stood, gentlemen, jerking their arms and legs about in agony, like the toy-shop figures that are moved by a piece of pack-thread. My uncle always said afterwards that this was one of the surest means he knew of for disposing of an enemy, but it was liable to one objection on the ground of expense, inasmuch as it involved the loss of a sword for every man disabled. "The mail! The mail!" cried the lady, running up to my uncle, and throwing her beautiful arms around his neck. "We may yet escape." "May!" cried my uncle. "Why, my dear, there is nobody else to kill, is there?" My uncle was rather disappointed, gentlemen, for he thought a little quiet bit of love-making would be agreeable after the slaughtering, if it were only to change the subject. "We have not an instant to lose here," said the young lady. "He," pointing to the young gentleman in sky blue, "is the only son of the powerful Marquis of Philotoville." I'm sure I probably said that wrong, but whatever, it's fine. "Well then, my dear, I'm afraid he'll never come to the title," said my uncle, looking coolly at the young gentleman as he stood fixed up against the wall, in the cockchafer fashion I have described. "You have cut off the entail, my love." "I have been torn from my home and my friends by these villains," said the young lady, her features glowing with indignation. "That wretch would have married me by violence in another hour." "Confound his impudence," said my uncle, bestowing a very contemptuous look upon the dying heir of Philotoville. "As you may guess from what you have seen," said the young lady, the party were prepared to murder me if I appealed to anyone for assistance. If their accomplices find us here, we are lost. 2 minutes hence may be too late. The mail!" With these words, overpowered by her feelings, an exertion of sticking the young Marquis of Philetoville, she sunk into my uncle's arms. My uncle caught her up, and bore her to the house door. There stood the mail, with 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses, ready harnessed, but no coachman, no guard, no hostler even, at the horses' heads. Gentlemen, I hope I do no injustice to my uncle's memory when I express my opinion that although he was a bachelor, he had held some ladies in his arms before this time. I believe, indeed, that he had rather a habit of kissing barmaids, and I know that in 1 or 2 instances he had been seen by credible witnesses to hug a landlady in a very perceptible manner. I mention the circumstance to show what a very uncommon sort of person this beautiful young lady must have been, to have affected my uncle in the way she did. He used to say that as her long dark hair trailed over his arm, and her beautiful dark eyes fixed themselves upon his face when she recovered, he felt so strange and nervous that his legs trembled beneath him. But who can look in a sweet, soft pair of dark eyes without feeling queer? I can't, gentlemen. I'm afraid to look at some eyes I know, and that's the truth of it. "You will never leave me," murmured the young lady. "Never," said my uncle. And he meant it, too. "My dear preserver," exclaimed the young lady. "My dear, kind, brave preserver." "Don't," said my uncle, interrupting her. "Why?" inquired the young lady. "Because your mouth looks so beautiful when you speak," rejoined my uncle, "that I'm afraid I shall be rude enough to kiss it." The young lady put up her hand as if to caution my uncle not to do so, and said, "No, she didn't say anything. She smiled. When you are looking at a pair of the most delicious lips in the world, and see them gently break into a roguish smile, if you are very near them, and nobody else by, you cannot better testify your admiration of their beautiful form and color than by kissing them at once. My uncle did so, and I honor him for it." "Hark!" cried the young lady, startling. "The noise of wheels and horses." "So it is," said my uncle, listening. He had a good ear for wheels and the trampling of hoofs, but there appeared to be so many horses and carriages rattling toward them from a distance that it was impossible to form a guess at their number. The sound was like that of 50 brakes, with 6 blood cattle in each. "We are pursued!" cried the young lady, clasping her hands. "We are pursued! I have no hope but in you." There was such an expression of terror in her beautiful face that my uncle made up his mind at once. He lifted her into the coach, told her not to be frightened, pressed his lips to hers once more, and then advised her to draw up the window to keep the cold air out, mounted to the box. "Stay, love!" cried the young lady. "What's the matter?" said my uncle from the coach-box. "I want to speak to you," said the young lady. "Only a word. Only one word, dearest." "Must I get down?" inquired my uncle. The lady made no answer, but she smiled again. Such a smile, gentlemen! It beat the other one all to nothing. My uncle descended from his perch in a twinkling. "What is it, my dear?" said my uncle, looking in at the coach window. The lady happened to bend forward at the time, and my uncle thought she looked more beautiful than she had done yet. He was very close to her just then, gentlemen, so he really ought to know. "What is it, my dear?" "Will you never love any one but me? Never marry any one beside?" said the young lady. My uncle swore a great oath that he would never marry anybody else, and the young lady drew in her head and pulled up the window. He jumped upon the box, squared his elbows, adjusted the ribbons, seized the whip which lay on the roof, gave one flick to the off-leader, and away went the 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses at 15 good English miles an hour, with the old mail coach behind them. Whew! How they tore along! The noise behind grew louder. The faster the old mail went, the faster came the pursuers. Men, horses, dogs were leagued in the pursuit. The noise was frightful, but above all rose the voice of the young lady, urging my uncle on and shrieking, "Faster! Faster!" They whirled past the dark streets, as feathers would be swept before a hurricane. Houses, gates, Churches, haystacks, objects of every kind they shot by with a velocity and noise like roaring waters suddenly let loose. The still noise of pursuit grew louder. And still my uncle could hear the young lady wildly screaming, "Faster! Faster!" My uncle plied whip and rein, and the horses flew onward till they were white with foam. And yet the noise behind increased, and yet the young lady cried, "Faster! Faster!" My uncle gave a loud stamp on the boot in the energy of the moment, and found that it was grey morning, and he was sitting in the wheelwright's yard, on the box of an old Edinburgh mail, shivering with the cold and wet, and stamping his feet to warm them. He got down, and looked eagerly inside for the beautiful young lady. Alas! There was neither door nor seat to the coach. It was a mere shell. Of course, my uncle knew very well that there was some mystery in the matter, and that everything had passed exactly as he used to relate it. He remained staunch to the great oath he had sworn to the beautiful young lady, refusing several eligible landladies on her account, and dying a bachelor at last. He always said what a curious thing it was that he should have found out by such a mere accident as his clambering over the palings that the ghosts of mail coaches and horses, guards, coachmen, and passengers were in the habit of making journeys regularly every night. He used to add that he believed he was the only living person who had ever been taken as a passenger on one of these excursions. And I think he was right, gentlemen. At least, I never heard of any other. "I wonder what these ghosts of mail coaches carry in their bags," said the landlord, who had listened to the whole story with profound attention. "The dead letters, of course," said the bagman. "Oh, to be sure," rejoined the landlord. "I never thought of that." Oh, I love Charles Dickens. He's such a fun writer. Well, everybody, I hope you enjoyed those ghost stories for your Halloween. Please feel free again to go back and watch some of my other videos, other Halloween ghost stories that I've done, books that I have read so far. And if you like what you see, like what you hear, please give me a thumbs up, a like, subscribe. Please follow me, leave comments, all the great things. I have another book coming out soon to read, probably within the next week or so. But I wanted to get this out ahead of Halloween so you guys had something to watch. So until then, I hope you guys have a fantastic Halloween. Please stay safe. Please have fun. And just look out for yourselves and each other. Until then, stay hydrated, and I will see you next time. Bye.